It was a sweltering summer afternoon in Memphis, 1976. Locals say Elvis slowed his Cadillac outside a small brick church. From inside, a choir's voices spilled onto the street. He stopped, stepped out, and walked straight into music that would stop history. If you've ever seen music stop someone in their tracks, you know moments like this can't be planned. Stick with me, this story may change how you hear Elvis forever. The heat shimmered off Union Avenue, blurring the edges of storefronts and telephone poles. It was the kind of day when the air felt heavy enough to slow your breathing. Elvis Presley was behind the wheel of his Cadillac. Windows cracked just enough to let the summer air in. The city moved around him, buses groaning at stops, the hum of cicadas filling gaps in traffic. His sunglasses caught the glare of the sun, and for a while it was just another drive through Memphis. Then he heard it. Not the radio, not a record from the 8-track. This was different, raw and alive. Voices, layered harmony, rising from somewhere ahead. He slowed, his attention locking on the sound. To his right stood a small white brick church. The paint flaked in places, a hand-painted sign reading New Hope Baptist swaying slightly in the breeze. Its doors were propped open, and from within came the music, a gospel choir, full-bodied and unfiltered, pouring into the street like sunlight. Elvis pulled to the curb. Witnesses say the Cadillac idled there for close to a minute, the low purr of the engine underscoring the steady rhythm of clapping hands inside. His head tilted, listening, eyes narrowing toward the open doorway. The moment stretched. Then the door of the Cadillac swung open. Black slacks, open collar shirt, gold-rimmed aviators, unmistakable. His boots hit the pavement with a muted thud. He glanced once up and down the street, then crossed toward the church. The closer he came, the clearer the details. The worn wood of the threshold, the faint smell of dust and old hymnals drifting into the warm air. Inside, voices swelled in perfect unison, filling every inch of space. He paused at the doorway, just outside the frame of sunlight falling across the floor. From there, he could see the backs of the choir, men in suits gone shiny at the elbows, women in patterned dresses, a few children squeezed between them, clapping offbeat but smiling wide. No one had turned yet. The choir was lost in the song, and Elvis stood still, one hand resting lightly on the doorframe. From the street, a pair of neighbors lingered, craning to see past him. The light caught the side of his face, and for a moment he seemed less the king and more just another man who had been stopped cold by music. He shifted his weight, the wooden step under his boot creaking softly. That small sound was enough to turn a single head, then another, and in the space of 2 beats, the music inside faltered. As one voice, a woman's, caught midline, realizing who was standing in the doorway. The choir didn't see him yet, but that was about to change. The wooden floor groaned under his first step inside. Heads turned, one by one, as if the sound traveled faster than the sight of him. A sharp inhale cut through the harmonies. Someone whispered, almost too softly to catch, "That's Elvis." The name moved through the room like a spark. The tenors on the back row exchanged quick glances. A young soprano's voice trembled, her next note catching before she found it again. But the choir didn't stop. They pushed on, harmonies rapping, the air in a warmth that clung to the wooden beams above. Elvis moved quietly down the aisle, the heel of each boot thudding against the boards in slow rhythm. He reached a pew near the back and slid in, the cool wood pressing against his forearm. In one slow motion, he removed his sunglasses, light from the stained glass cut across his face, shards of blue and crimson, spilling down his cheek and catching in the folds of his open collar. The gold of his hair seemed almost unreal in that soft glow. Across the aisle, a woman fanned herself with a cardboard paddle, the kind with a funeral home's name stamped on the back. Her hands shook as she leaned toward her neighbor, lips barely moving. Outside, the sound of footsteps crunched on gravel. 2 teenage boys stood at the doorway, peering over shoulders to see what had brought the church to this strange, charged stillness. Elvis's eyes stayed fixed on the choir. Some say he was mouthing the words, his lips moving without sound, his gaze distant, almost reverent. Others recall a slow, steady tap of his right hand against the edge of the pew, perfectly in time with the clapping. The song built toward its final chorus, the voices swelling, the tempo rising. The air in the room seemed to vibrate with the sound, and somewhere in the second row, a girl no older than 12 grinned wide enough to show the gap in her front teeth. From his seat, Elvis's expression softened, and then a new movement at the front. The choir leader, a tall man in a faded grey suit with a frayed tie, turned from his spot near the pulpit. He didn't speak, just lifted one hand and beckoned. The gesture was small but deliberate, an invitation. The murmur from the congregation was barely contained. A few people shifted forward in their seats, eyes darting between the leader and the man in the back pew. Elvis's hand, resting on the bench, curled slightly into a fist. His head tilted just enough to acknowledge the call, and still he didn't move. Not yet. The choir leader smiled, the kind of smile that said he already knew what was coming, and beckoned again. The last note of the song lingered, voices fading into the stillness. No one clapped, no one moved. Every eye was on the man in the back pew, waiting to see if the king of rock and roll would rise. The silence stretched so long you could hear the faint hum of the ceiling fan overhead. Then Elvis stood. The sound of the bench shifting under his weight broke the stillness. Slow steps carried him into the aisle. His boots struck the wood in a steady rhythm, each one a metronome tick that seemed to sync with every heartbeat in the room. Light from the stained glass shifted across him as he moved. Reds flashed across his shoulder, blues rippled along the gold of his hair. His rings, heavy, ornate, caught the light with each swing of his hand. The choir's line broke. Singers turning their bodies slightly, eyes following him. He passed between them like a slow tide, nodding once toward a tenor who couldn't stop grinning. At the front, the choir leader waited. His faded grey suit hung a little loose at the shoulders, his tie slightly off-center. The man's face was open, warm, lined with years of Sunday mornings. Brother Elvis, his voice carried without a microphone, rich with welcome. Would you lead us in one? The crowd held its breath. Some leaned forward. A woman in the front row clutched her fan to her chest. Elvis paused, his lips curved. Not a full smile, but something quieter. He gave one short nod. The leader stepped back, making space in front of the pulpit. No microphone, no instruments, just the creak of the old floor beneath his boots as Elvis turned to face the room. He inhaled deeply, chest rising. When he began, the first note was low, unhurried, the opening line of Amazing Grace. His voice was different here. Softer, less polished than on record, but heavier with something lived in. Every syllable carried weight, each word like it had passed through fire before reaching the air. A woman in the third pew wiped at her eyes. The little girl with the gap-toothed smile clasped her hands together, leaning forward on the bench. The song filled the church without needing volume. It was in the way he shaped the notes, letting them settle in the rafters before moving on. The high windows rattled faintly, as if they, too, were listening. When he reached the final line, his voice thinned just enough to draw the room in closer. The last word floated in the still air for a breath before it was gone. The quiet afterward felt holy. Then a small movement. From the side aisle, a boy stepped forward. No older than 9, sleeves hanging over his hands, something clutched tight against his chest. He kept his eyes low as he approached, the sound of his shoes against the floor the only noise in the room. Whatever he held, he was bringing it straight to Elvis. The boy stopped just in front of Elvis, still holding the object tight against his chest. His Sunday shirt was too big, sleeves covering half his hands. Elvis knelt, the black fabric of his slacks creasing as he lowered himself until they were eye level. The boy's fingers uncurled, revealing a small, worn hymn book. The edges were frayed, the spine soft from years of turning pages. Elvis took it gently, turning it over in his hands. Inside the front cover, in faded blue ink, was a stamp, property of New Hope Baptist Church. He looked back at the boy. Some in the congregation say they saw Elvis lean in and whisper, "You keep it, sing every day." Others remember him slipping a folded bill into the boy's pocket before handing the hymn book back. Either way, the boy nodded, eyes wide, as if he understood the weight of the moment. The room felt warmer now, not from the summer heat, but from something else, a closeness, a shared breath. Even the 2 boys still peeking from the doorway had inched inside, leaning against the wall, their eyes locked on the scene. Elvis stood, keeping one hand on the boy's shoulder for just a beat longer than expected. Then he looked toward the choir leader. "Mind if I join you for one more?" The leader's grin answered before his words did. "We'd be honored." Elvis stepped into the line of singers. His height made him stand out, but he didn't take center stage. Instead, he slid between a young alto and an older bass, nodding to each like he'd been part of the group for years. The leader raised his hand, and the first chord rang out, "I'll Fly Away." The song erupted with joy. Hands clapped, feet tapped against the worn floor. Elvis's voice wove into the harmonies, not overpowering, but blending, like he'd sung with them all his life. A woman near the front let out a high, sharp ma'am. In rhythm, the little girl in the second pew couldn't stop smiling, bouncing in time with the beat from the back. The teenage boys' nervous grins shifted into wide-eyed disbelief as they watched a living legend sing in a place most folks in the city didn't even know was there. The music spilled out through the open doors, catching the attention of a few people walking by on the street. They stopped, listening, drawn in by the sound of pure joy as the final verse soared. Elvis closed his eyes, clapping along. And when the last "I'll Fly Away" rang out, it was followed by laughter, applause, and more than a few tears. But before anyone could gather themselves enough to speak, Elvis did something that would leave the entire church buzzing for weeks. The final notes of "I'll Fly Away" were still hanging in the rafters when Elvis stepped back from the line of singers. He didn't make a speech, no wave, no announcement. Instead, he shook the choir leader's hand, a firm, 2-handed grip, and leaned in close enough to say something only the man could hear. The leader nodded, eyes glistening. Elvis turned to a few others, offering quick embraces, a hand on a shoulder here, a brief clasp there. Then, just like that, he slipped into the aisle. The crowd didn't fully register what was happening until he was halfway down. By the time they stood, he was already at the door. The sunlight outside hit him hard, wrapping him in gold as he descended the steps. The Cadillac's engine came to life with a low rumble. Elvis opened the driver's door, glanced back toward the open church doors, and gave the smallest of nods. Then he was gone, the car rolling away before most of the congregation had even stepped outside. Inside, the church felt different. People spoke in hushed voices, replaying what they had just witnessed. But the real surprise was still days away. 1 week later, on a quiet Friday afternoon, a delivery truck pulled up outside New Hope Baptist Church. 2 men carried in a large cardboard box, then another, and another. When the choir leader sliced the first one open, the scent of new leather filled the room. Inside were brand new hymnals, dozens of them, bound in deep maroon, pages crisp and untouched, stamped in gold leaf on the inside cover of each. In one, there was something more. A folded note in tidy script. Keep singing. You never know who's listening. The leader called the boy to the front. The same boy who had handed Elvis his old hymn book now held a new one, the gold stamp catching the afternoon light. He clutched it to his chest the same way he had held the worn one a week earlier. Only this time, his smile was unshaken, steady, and proud. Word spread fast. By Sunday morning, people from other neighborhoods were showing up early, hoping to sit in the same pews where Elvis had once stood. Some came for the story. Others came for the music. But everyone came knowing they'd stepped into a place where something rare had happened. And long after the hymnals lost their new book smell, the note remained tacked to the wall in the choir room, a quiet reminder that the king of rock and roll had once chosen this little church for his stage. But for the boy, it meant something even greater, something his family would never forget. The boy's mother said he didn't stop talking about it for days. At breakfast the next morning, between bites of buttered toast, he told her how Elvis had sung without a microphone, how his voice filled the room like it came from the walls themselves. He described the handshake, the quiet words no one else heard, and when he showed her the new hymnal, still smelling faintly of leather, he held it like it was something alive. That Sunday, when the choir rose to sing, his voice cut through the rest, not louder than everyone else, but clear, steady, and sure. He didn't hide in the sound anymore. By the next month, he'd joined the youth choir officially. His mother said he'd come home from school humming harmonies under his breath, tapping rhythms on the kitchen table, and every week, before walking out the door for church, he'd opened the old hymn book, the one with the faded stamp, the frayed edges, and run his fingers along the cover before setting it back on the shelf. It stayed in the same place for decades. Years passed. The boy grew taller, his voice deepened, and his place in the choir shifted from the back row to the front. Somewhere along the way, he became the one holding the pitch pipe, the one setting the tempo before the first chord rang out, and then one Sunday morning, in that same small brick church, he was the man in the faded suit at the front, the leader, the one who raised a hand to start the song. The hymn book still sat on the shelf in his home, alongside the maroon one was stamped inside. People who knew the story would sometimes ask why he never moved the old one to the church display case, alongside the framed note from Elvis. He'd smile and say, "Because that one's still working on me." Over the years, the story became part of the church itself. New members heard it within weeks of joining. Visiting pastors told it to their congregations back home. Some called it chance, that Elvis just happened to drive down Union Avenue that day, just happened to hear the choir, just happened to step inside. Others called it providence, but everyone agreed on this. What happened inside that church didn't feel like an accident. It was the kind of moment that bends the course of a life. The way a river shifts after a storm, cutting a new channel that runs deeper than the old one. The man who had once been that boy knew it better than anyone. He'd tell the youth choir about it sometimes, but never with the swagger of a celebrity story. He'd talk about how Elvis didn't take the spotlight, how he blended into the harmony, how he gave without asking for thanks, and then he'd say, "The king told me to sing every day, so I did." The lesson stuck, not just with him, but with anyone who heard it. Kindness, they realized, didn't need a stage. It didn't need cameras or headlines. Sometimes it was just a quiet gift, left without a name, except for 3 small letters in gold. Decades later, the hymnals Elvis had given were still in use, their pages worn, corners soft, and the note, "Keep singing. You never know who's listening," still hung in the choir room, yellowed at the edges, but untouched by dust. The boy's voice eventually grew older, raspier, but he sang until he couldn't anymore. When his own son took over leading the choir, the old hymn book stayed right where it had always been, waiting for the next pair of hands to pick it up, open it, and see what could happen when music stops someone in their tracks. Sometimes, the smallest act, a song, a gift, a few quiet words, can echo longer than a lifetime. If this moved you, share it with someone who believes a small act can echo for decades. Have you ever had a moment where someone's kindness completely changed your path?